Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Our guest today is Brian Reisinger, a writer, a conservative operative who has served as a spokesman for United States Senators Lamar Alexander and Ron Johnson, and also for Governor Scott Walker. He currently serves as president and chief operating officer of Platform Communications, a Midwestern-based strategic communications firm. He grew up on a dairy farm in southern Wisconsin. Brian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Emily, thanks for having me.
Now, Brian and I know each other because we're both from Wisconsin, and I should also take the opportunity to mention that like half of the Federalist team is from Wisconsin. We have this like weird Wisconsin mafia going. There's like 5 of us randomly, so we're very familiar with the dairy state.
Well, this is why there's so much good content coming out of the Federalist. The Wisconsin mafia that at one time sort of was at the height of the political game in not only Wisconsin but Washington. Now, really, the Federalist has the best home to the Wisconsin mafia. Well, you guys are taking things by storm.
That's very flattering. Well, see, this is why we have Brian on today, because he wrote an article recently that was kind of a reflection at what happened to the Wisconsin Republican Party. And for our listeners, you shouldn't be worried that this episode is going to be too Wisconsin specific, because what we're going to do is look at the Republican Party through the lens of the Wisconsin Republican Party, what that can tell us about what happened in 2016 and what that might tell us about what will happen in 2020, and honestly what will happen beyond 2020. What is this base of voters that may have voted for Obama and then voted passionately for Donald Trump? How can the Republican Party serve them? That's where we want to take the conversation today. So Brian, who, I mentioned earlier, he's been involved in a lot of campaigns and communications, running communications for offices. He's done a lot of campaigns in the state of Wisconsin. He's very familiar with the voters of the state of Wisconsin, very familiar with the Republican voters of the state of Wisconsin and the Republican leaders of the state of Wisconsin. Brian, tell us about the article that you wrote for National Review and basically about the arc of the Wisconsin Republican Party as you traced it from some of those fresh-faced young leaders back in the day, Paul Ryan, Reince Priebus, to where it is right now.
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, your intro to that really makes an important point for, I think, listeners, which is that the story of the Wisconsin Republican Party is really, in a lot of ways, the story of the National Republican Party and sort of the conservative movement's rise. There are some obvious ways in which it was. Paul Ryan becoming Speaker of the House, Reince Priebus becoming head of the Republican National Committee and chief of staff to the first Republican president to win Wisconsin since the 1980s, since Reagan. And then Scott Walker, who obviously for a good period of time was the most consequential governor in the country with Act 10 and the recall and all of that happened. So there was so much history going on and coming out of Wisconsin and kind of shaping what was going on with the national movement. In a lot of ways, if you can understand Wisconsin, you can understand where the conservative movement has been and where it's going. And that's because of some of those top leaders. It's also because of some of the things that happened that made Wisconsin really a top battleground in 2020. So I just wanted to preface it with that, which is that this is, I think, a story that can be applicable for anybody who's trying to figure out, what the heck's going on in conservative politics and where do things go from here. I, as you said, had worked for Governor Walker, Ron Johnson, and prior to that, I was a journalist in Wisconsin before I got to politics. And so I had a chance to look at all this, and all throughout all of the years, I was sort of always asking myself, how is it that this one state, and I'm biased because I'm from here, I know you are too, hopefully people feel like we're still a little bit balanced about this when we say that there's really no other state that produced a Speaker of the House, a White House Chief of Staff, and the most consequential governor all at the same period of time, right? And there's really no other state that had, therefore, national tax reform that Paul Ryan helped get through, Act 10 and collective bargaining reform that really kind of blew up in the kind of 2010s. And then also played the role that it did in delivering the White House for President Trump. Hopefully people can kind of see that connection. And I was asking, always, where did this come from? How did that strength occur? Was it just luck that a couple of these people happen to have success at the same time?
From the same party, we should add.
Right, totally. And so what I found is that there was a common thread through all of it. And the common thread was that the Wisconsin Republican Party found a way to forge some striking examples of unity where other conservative movements were faltering.
Mm.
The biggest example, but not the only, the biggest example of that was in 2010, when you had other states that either had Republican parties being taken over by Tea Party candidates, or you had establishment candidates kind of snuffing out the Tea Party. You had that kind of establishment versus Tea Party battle going on. And in some cases, that meant that there were some Tea Party and conservative and grassroots movement voices that were stifled, and the party was not as strong because they didn't have all that energy. In other cases, frankly, you had times where some Tea Party candidates were not electable. And so that civil war often wasn't serving either side. And in Wisconsin, what happened is Reince and other people said, we are going to channel this energy. We're going to find a way to grab onto all of this energy and principle and outrage, and we're going to marry it with our party infrastructure. And what happened is you had the energy and the conviction of the conservative grassroots, you had the strength and the money of the establishment sort of married up, and you had this massive infrastructure in Wisconsin that was born. So not only did Scott Walker get elected that year and Ron Johnson, but it was the beginning of this kind of growing juggernaut that lasted for years to come.
Those are the Tea Party years, to be clear, and that's what's part of this that's so interesting about the story is that you're arguing, and I think correctly, that the Wisconsin GOP married the energy of the Tea Party to the state party establishment. And I think that's probably seems like those two sides should be hostile to each other. We see that definitely on the national level, where you have the grassroots that, I think a lot of Tea Party people were as upset with the Republican establishment as they were with the Democrat establishment. So why was it that some of these folks in Wisconsin had the foresight to say, we need to bring this into our infrastructure?
Yeah, they say that luck is where preparation meets opportunity, and so I think that there is a little bit of good fortune that goes into this. But there were people who had some striking insight, and the reason is they come up through the grassroots. So people like Reince Priebus, who people associate with the White House and the RNC, don't realize that at one time he was a local grassroots leader, and he climbed up through and he became the district chairman for the local GOP, and I mean he was really a grassroots guy. Scott Walker, before he was governor or Milwaukee County executive or state legislator, was the district chairman for the local GOP in his congressional district. So you had, Paul Ryan came up through a lot of the same grassroots network that Reince did. So you had these people who they had convictions, they were talented politicians and operatives, and the sort of people who were getting involved in the broader party, but they also had kind of cut their teeth in the grassroots. And that's something that frankly goes all the way back to Tommy Thompson, who really built up the Republican Party from a minority party into a party that could win at times statewide, because he traveled the state kind of just visiting the local GOP and attending Lincoln Day dinners where there was like nobody there. So it's kind of in Wisconsin Republicans' DNA to be a little more grassroots than your average Republican across the country, I think. And a lot of these guys who were there to seize that moment in 2010 and then build upon it afterward had come up through the grassroots. And so that's why when you get to 2010, people like Ron Johnson, he wasn't the party guy, but he sprang forth from the Tea Party. It was party activists. It was people like the Reinces and the Paul Ryans and the Scott Walkers who were involved in the grassroots. It was a new generation of those up and coming grassroots people who were like, hey, this guy in Oshkosh, he tells it like it is, he should run. So whether it's people who are in the party for a long time or whether it's outsiders, it was really our candidates and the people making decisions were kind of springing forth from the grassroots themselves.
I think a lot of people would look at the arc of the Wisconsin Republican Party and say, well, hasn't the experiment failed? Hasn't this experiment in marrying the grassroots to the party establishment failed? Because if we do hold up these particular figures as symbols of the Wisconsin Republican Party's ascent, Reince Priebus, Scott Walker, Paul Ryan, are not in, Reince Priebus is not in the White House, Paul Ryan's not in the House, and Scott Walker is not in the governor's mansion or any other office, and the same goes for former Speaker Ryan. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, that's what the other side loves to say. And it's also an easy narrative for the media. There were all these stories. I mean, I was on Walker's campaign in 2018 after doing Ron Johnson's campaign in 2016. So I saw two extremely close races. The first of which kind of propelled us to the zenith, and then the last of which, liberals and the media sort of latch onto to say like, aha, you see, like the Wisconsin Republicans can't play a perfect game every single time. And what I would say to that is that there are still some incredibly striking bright spots for the Wisconsin conservative movement. And this is not meant to be blind optimism. It's meant to point out to some counterfactuals that when people look at them, they realize, oh yeah, actually, like 2018 was a very bad year for Republicans. And it was a particularly bad year for those of us in Wisconsin from the standpoint of losing Governor Walker. And also it was the year that Paul Ryan retired. And that wasn't long after Ryan stepped out of the spotlight. So a lot of that stuff did coalesce at the same time. But when you look at what happened in Wisconsin versus Michigan and Pennsylvania and some of those other states that had sort of had these interesting shifts to the right at certain times, what you see is that the Wisconsin conservative movement still has deep Republican majorities in the legislature. So that legislature is still there to check Tony Evers. The Republicans in Wisconsin still have succeeded in getting conservative back candidates onto the Supreme Court, such as Justice Brian Hagedorn, who was elected the April after Governor Walker's loss. There is still, situations like Congressman Brian Style, who ended up succeeding Paul Ryan in his congressional seat, beating Randy Bryce, who was supposed to be the great hope of the Democrat Party. We love Randy. And, Style beat him like a drum. And this guy was a symbol of the Democrats dismantling.
A lot of money.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. He raised so much money, enough money that at one point people were saying he's going to give Paul Ryan a run for his money. And then when it became clear that wasn't going to happen, they were saying, oh, well, he's still going to force Paul Ryan to spend money elsewhere, which may have been true to a degree. And then when Paul Ryan stepped down, they're like, Randy Bryce is going to trounce whatever Republican runs. So it's true that 2018 and some of the years around that time were tough, but there's also these striking bright spots where, not to dog Pennsylvania, Michigan, and other places, but they didn't have some of that continued success. So the real true measure of a political movement is when you do succeed you succeed at higher levels than other movements? And when you face challenges, do they not knock you back as far, right? Like, are your peaks higher and are your valleys not as deep? And I think that is still true of the Wisconsin conservative movement. And there's still things that characterize that are lessons for political movements everywhere.
The other thing, the other component of all of this is that Wisconsin and Wisconsin is similar to other states in the respect that it has the sort of like working class, it has the rural voters, it has the blue collar voters. It has that sort of, it has that voter makeup, and that voter makeup has made the state heavily Democratic for decades. And it was really after 2010, after the Tea Party years, that we started to see the legislature, for instance, both houses, like since then, they've been pretty red. It hasn't really been, there have been really no threats to the Republican leadership on the state level, other than Governor Walker's loss. What is the Republican Party in Wisconsin? How do they message, and how have they been messaging to these voters that they were clearly reaching before Donald Trump was even a blip on the political radar? If you look at someone like Sean Duffy, who took over David Obey's district, who was in there for literally for decades, Democrat, this Democratic stronghold, it wasn't Trump that turned that district red. It was a Tea Party Republican. And so I think there's an awareness there about the messaging that the Wisconsin Republican Party may have understood early.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, President Trump, no question, has a connection with those voters, and there's no question that he poured gas on that fire. And, when he came down that golden escalator, he immediately began connecting with some of these people. But even before he did that, there was a lot going on. So you touched on it with Duffy. It's also true that when Governor Walker did Act 10, it's a huge irony because it's cast as this like evil Republican Koch brother assault on the working man. But the reality is that the big government special interest unions and some of the government workers that were part of that membership had that opinion. But the broader electorate, like the taxpayers, most of whom in Wisconsin are working people, felt like he was sticking up for them. He was standing up for taxpayers. And so it was one of these moments where a conservative policy connected with working families and blue collar and rural folks, not your traditional kind of, wingtip wearing blue blazer Republicans in the suburbs only, but also the working class. And so it was an opportunity for Republicans to show, hey, here's how our policies are going to put more money in your pocket. And, tax cuts and other things fall in that bucket, but conservatives so often fail to make those arguments effectively. And so there truly was this populist strain earlier in Wisconsin. In the recall, when Wisconsinites rejected recalling Scott Walker, a big reason was they were just sick of the Madison political games. Take 10 seconds listening to Ron Johnson talk, and you can tell that he's a guy who came up on the shop floor, right? Like, this is a guy who built his company, slept in the back, did the books at night, and worked on the shop floor during the day. Like, so all of these people really connected. And it is one of the reasons, I do think also that the grassroots connection for the Republican Party is one of the reasons that the Wisconsin Republican Party is a little bit more populist. And I know that's a dirty word in some circles.
It's a great word.
As it should be. But, a little bit more conservative, a little bit more populist, a little bit more kind of fighting for you, as opposed to just that intellectual conservatism. In Wisconsin, for a long period of time, it was both. And I think that some of those ingredients still exist here. But it was a unique thing, and you're right, it touched on something that Donald Trump later tapped into in a bigger way as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you finger the Act 10 debacle, because Act 10 was, as listeners may remember, about unions. And to look back and reflect on what happened with Act 10, where you had hundreds of thousands of people protesting at the Capitol as a populist moment, is, again, that's confusing. And I was wondering if you can sort of flesh out why anti-union initiatives would have populist appeal in a traditionally pro-union state.
Yeah. When I was a reporter, well before I got into politics, I covered county government up in like central Wisconsin. It was Obie country at the time. So you mentioned Congressman Obie. And it was right around the time that Sean Duffy was declaring. So I actually covered his announcement at the time in my past life. And one of the things that was going on is there was all these huge fights at local government levels where there were splits going on over union contracts. And the reason for that was the unions were still seeking pay raises on top of the usual built-in cost of living increases that they get at a time when private sector workers, their salaries were frozen. This was the Great Recession. So you had private sector workers, people who are working at, a good local company on the manufacturing line, or even people who are maybe a little bit more upper middle class, like the whole spectrum of people who are just working in the private sector economy, which, by the way, contrary to what the media will tell you and the Democrats will tell you, is most people. All these people had their wages frozen at best if they weren't losing their jobs, right? And so people were really hurting, and they saw these, public sector unions coming in and pounding the table to get more raises on top of the built-in raises they were already getting. And so it really became a taxpayer versus the union thing. And the unions sort of lost control of that message because I suppose some of them were trying to represent their membership genuinely, but others of them were just trying to kind of like push it a little further, and they were out of touch with what was going on in the economy. And all of these people whose wages were frozen, if they even had a job still, were saying, like, why am I as a taxpayer paying for your raise when I just got a pay cut or I just lost my job? And so it really was part of that huge economic shakeup that occurred around the time of the stimulus and TARP and all of that. Wisconsin had its own version of that shakeup going on.
The other thing is, we don't remember this as clearly because the Trump era is so dominant. But we forget that going into 2010, this is coming on the end of the Bush years, when the left was really ratcheting up its rhetoric. And, some people will go as far back as Newt Gingrich or Barry Goldwater or whatever to say the ratcheting up of political rhetoric is the fault of Republicans. But the left was hot at the end of the Bush administration. And when the Act 10 protests started up, I think some of the populist appeal of Scott Walker and the voting for Scott Walker in the recall had to do with the fact that they saw average people saw protesters, far left, radical protesters screaming in Republicans' faces, trying to chase them out of the Capitol and doing all kinds of nonsense. And when we think right now about the way the left treats Donald Trump and how that might drive some people, in fact, to support Donald Trump, maybe this was a preview of that.
Yeah, totally. It was a huge backlash against the left overreaching. And so when you look at all of the ways that the left overreaches now, whether it's in specific states or nationally, and it gets so overheated and everybody's a racist and all that sort of stuff, that happened in Wisconsin. People had a huge backlash against that. The other thing that the Democrats in Wisconsin, and I think a lot of national liberals and leftists still don't understand, is the degree to which people do still view them as part of the power structure, because they are in favor of that bigger government, because they are, it just sort of breeds a sense of like status quo, government knows best, like the governing class, people who really think government is the answer to everything tend toward that. So I remember, just to go back to the O.B. Duffy years for a second, when I was a reporter, I didn't think of myself as a conservative or a liberal, but what I knew was that there was no way Dave Obey was ever even going to say Sean Duffy's name, even though Sean Duffy was like the most serious contender he'd had in a very long time. And ultimately, a lot of people would argue Duffy maybe pushed Obey out of that race. Mm-hmm. And I remember, as a reporter, I felt that Republican or Democrat, you should have to fight for your seat. And so I would devise questions and ways to go running at Dave Obey at events to try to get him to say Sean Duffy's name. And he would like rip my face off, and it'd be like, cool. And then I would come back the next time and try. And Democrats really were an entrenched interest in Wisconsin, raising taxes and, all that stuff with Governor Jim Doyle's budgets. And so they didn't realize the degree to which they were viewed as the power structure, even times where they weren't really in power. They represent Madison in the same way that a lot of people kind of think of the Democrats as representing Washington. And understand that. And they didn't understand that the people who were overreacting were actually going to turn people back toward the Republicans.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And that district is one of my favorites in the country, not just because I'm very familiar with it, but also because in the Obey years, this is a district that was very blue, very, very blue, deep blue. And after Duffy got into office, and he no longer holds that seat now, but in fact, he actually is hosting a podcast for the Federalist, which you can check out on our YouTube channel. But now that is deep red Trump country. It is like you drive through that district, and it's one of those places in America where the Trump signs are not the typical yard signs. They're actually just like these massive homemade pieces of plywood with, Trump in big paint written on them. And so that I'm curious, as somebody who is reporting on that race before that race and is familiar with that district. Actually, I think probably the district that you live in is similar to that. What is it that brought those people to Trump? And then we can kind of look forward and see if they'll still be with him in 2020.
So in Wisconsin, it is true that there was something going on prior, and that Wisconsin Republicans had tapped into showing working families how lower taxes and less government and other conservative policies could connect with their real world needs. And that's a real thing that was happening in Wisconsin. It wasn't rural voters being hoodwinked or fooled into voting against their own interests. They were seeing how conservative policies would benefit them, and they were seeing how politicians who were willing to kind of shake things up and maybe break a few eggs along the way could change their life. People forget that Sean Duffy won under the old maps. So the Democrats always say, oh, well, it got redrawn into a red district. Sean Duffy won under the prior pre-redistricting map. So he won Obey's actual district.
Yeah.
So that was underway. And then in terms of the president's connection, a lot of it was, there was certainly, he was talking about tax cuts and things like that, even though he was also talking about trade and other issues that some conservatives were less sure of. But he was talking about tax cuts and things like that. He was clearly anti-government. But also he was anti-politics. He was anti-politician. And that is so important. It's the same reason that people in rural Wisconsin voted for Scott Walker, because they felt like the recall was a political game. Like, we just elected this guy. If you want to beat him, go beat him. But you don't recall him just because you don't like what he did. He's doing what he said he was going to do. Mm-hmm. Ron Johnson is somebody who, like, you look at him and you realize that he's screaming at the TV in the same way that you are. So these are people who were making that connection. And Donald Trump did the same thing. He came in, he was anti-politics. And this is one of the big mysteries for a lot of people. They say it's a unicorn, that voter who would vote for Obama and Trump and vote for, maybe Bernie in the Democrat primary. Yeah. Maybe they voted for Tammy at one time, and then they voted for Ron Johnson and Scott Walker. There are people who've had those kind of permutations, and they're consistent. The political system isn't. The political parties are the ones that are changing. Those people don't like politics. So when Barack Obama came on the scene and promised a new path forward, they liked what they heard. And all of these rural voters who are supposedly a bunch of closed-minded racists voted for Barack Obama, the nation's first black president, because they felt that he was the agent of change. In 2016, they thought Trump was the agent of change. And in many of the intervening years, they thought Scott Walker and Ron Johnson and Sean Duffy were agents of change. So that's one of the things that is truly missed, that people don't understand, is it's about who's taking on the status quo.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. It's not necessarily a policy platform, and I think in the political class and here in Washington, people love to talk about how it was Trump's trade policies and his immigration policies, and they think about these like populist policy areas as reasons that he was able to sort of woo these voters over, when I think so much of it was just this feeling that you're voting for the anti-establishment candidate, and it's less of like, that's why you would go for Obama, Trump, and Bernie. And Washington is so policy heavy that they do, and so like partisan heavy, like Democrat versus Republican, as opposed to, people's what really drives people to vote, that they don't understand why people would vote that way. They just don't understand it. And I'm curious if you think Trump still holds that appeal, if his hold over those voters has gotten stronger, and if Joe Biden has been able to make inroads with some of those folks in Wisconsin.
It's a super interesting question. I think it has. We'll have to see how things shake out, but I think President Trump's hold with those voters, connection with those voters, has remained. I think that there's real upside. I think the Democrats and a lot of the media are hoping just that there aren't any more rural voters to be found. They're hoping that Trump wrung every rural voter out of the woodwork in 2016 so that there's no further upside. I think there is further upside, and you see that because the opposite of what's happening in the suburbs, where the suburbs are becoming more kind of swing territory, the rural areas are becoming more and more conservative. And that's happening on Senate and Assembly level districts. And so I think that realignment is still underway, and I think that President Trump still does connect with those people in a very big way. And I think his campaign has correctly calculated that there's more upside for him there. The question is, does that upside, and this gets into 2020 prognostication, but does that upside in the rural areas outweigh some of the changes that have gone on in the suburbs that cut the other way? And a lot of that is unknowable in as close of a battleground state as Wisconsin, but I think the connection with the rural voters remains. But people have to remember that it's fickle. Everybody wants to assume that what happened in the last election is the way it's now going to be going forward, and you can't recreate it. But the reality is that political reality is being remade with every election. And, the Democrats not too long ago had rural Wisconsin, and then it swung and flipped. And so I do think Republican candidates still connect. I think President Trump does and other Republicans do. But that's not to say that it's a constant forever. Mm-hmm. And I do think that the Democrats, mostly their strategy is about maximizing the urban vote and eating into the suburbs. But I do think that they hope that kind of the working class Joe thing can eat into some of these rural areas. We'll see if that's the case. I'm skeptical, but it's always dangerous to make predictions in politics. So
do you think reports like the New York Times investigation into Trump allegedly paying $750 in taxes, do you think that's something that legit, and like this might sound like a ridiculous question, but I'm actually curious if you think that is something that can drive rural, maybe populist oriented voters to Joe Biden, or at least away from Trump, and maybe they stay home on election day?
It's a super good question. I think the question is, can Democrats message effectively to rural voters at all? And right now, they've shown that they can't. So whether it's the tax return issue or whether it's others, the question is, is there a worthy vehicle that is going to connect with rural voters? And right now, so many rural voters, including where I'm from in Sauk County, Southwest Wisconsin, which is even more swingy, actually, it's still a swingy rural area. People there feel like the Democrats and liberals look down their nose at them. They feel like they consider it flyover country. And that makes the rest of your message more difficult to hear when you don't think that the person coming to you really respects you, really cares what you think. They just think you're voting against your own best interest because you've been hoodwinked by the Republicans and by the president. So I think that's the biggest barrier to that. Now, the other interesting thing is just like the phenomena of President Trump, by which I mean just the situation that is Trump, which is to say, like, on the one hand, you could see how Democrats could grab onto that and try to hammer really any Republican. On the other hand, President Trump said in the debates in 2016, like, why would I pay taxes? That would be dumb. I should be paying as few taxes as possible. And he just seizes those arguments by the throat and kind of throws them to the side. And so it's interesting. I mean, it could be an attack that could have something to it if only Democrats could message to rural voters, and if only Donald Trump hadn't already started spoken to it.
I think that's the thing people don't understand about Donald Trump is that he has acknowledged all of what the opposition sees as his flaws. He acknowledges his lapses in character. He acknowledges, that he doesn't pay a lot of taxes. He acknowledges that he gamed the political system and the business system. And so, whereas you think populists might naturally be disgusted by a billionaire gaming the system, they actually think Trump is the change agent because he knows how the system works, and so he can go disrupt it. So it's a matter of prioritization. I want to talk about the suburbs. Actually, here I have one question on this before we shift to the suburbs. What can the Republican Party do to keep its appeal with rural voters after Trump? Because there is no more Donald Trump is a singular figure in American politics. There will never be a Donald Trump. There will never be somebody else who says, "Of course I didn't pay taxes," and "Of course I said this and that." So what can Republicans do? Is it policy? Is it temperament? What can they do to keep these voters going forward?
Totally. I think it's policy more than temperament. And the reason I say that is you're right. President Trump won't be here forever. And also a lot of that is unique to him. And so it is good for rural voters to hear that a conservative candidate is going to fight for them. It is good to kind of have that fighting spirit, but nobody is going to be able to just sort of sail past all the things that the Democrats do in the way that President Trump has because of how big his megaphone is. He's been a unique figure in American politics. Love him or hate him, he's been a unique figure. And so I do think that Republicans have to have a policy connection. They have to show they're willing to fight, but they also have to have a policy connection. And I think that's one of the challenges that our party is going to have long term. It's counterintuitive because so many people are like, oh, well, the Republicans have rural voters on lock. Well, that's how the Democrats lost rural voters, because they thought they had them on lock. And we do need to have a policy agenda. It probably centers around taxes because Midwestern states like Wisconsin still, despite the valiant efforts of Scott Walker, still are among the highest taxed because of the legacy of liberal leadership for decades before that. So taxes is probably a part of it. There probably has to be a better education and healthcare reform platform within our party, new ideas that can show working families that we can fight for them on those issues, just because you have to have something more permanent than one politician's personality.
Right. Yeah, I think education and healthcare, those are so interesting. It's so interesting to me that you zero in on those areas as somebody who knows voters and knows exactly the voters that we're talking about and, does work with them, because that healthcare is consistently one of the top issues people say that they vote on, and Republicans have absolutely zero plan there. But in terms of reaching out to working families, you can see how education is an interesting one to me, because that's the way Republicans talk about education policy, I think, is getting better and better, because what needs to happen in the education system, I think people are increasingly aware, is a total rebuilding, especially something that we're learning throughout COVID. And I actually think Republicans are well equipped to offer some solutions to those issues, particularly now that you have the Trump administration, for instance, openly talking about the perils of critical race theory. But you know this issue better than I do. I imagine that, I always think that when Donald Trump talks about media corruption, he's not talking about media corruption. If you're a rural voter, if you're a populist-oriented voter, that's actually a policy platform from Donald Trump. And so I think part of the Republican Party, as silly as this sounds to people in Washington, also has to be, the party that stands against elite corruption. And that's difficult for any major political party to do because their leaders are necessarily entrenched. And I think that's difficult.
And in particular, once you get into power, you're pulling the levers of power, you're suddenly dealing with the trappings of power, and it becomes very difficult for any political party. Republicans have to look at themselves long and hard on that to make sure that they don't fall into that, because as you said, it's in many ways just a matter of time. I agree in education. I promise I'm not trying to filibuster your suburban question, but
no,
it's interesting. It's interesting on the healthcare thing, which is to say, if you look at where Joe Biden went in the debate and where all the Democrats have gone, some Washington wise man said, don't talk about pro-choice and abortion and guns and all that with the Amy Coney Barrett thing. Somebody in Washington said, remember 2018 when we bludgeoned the Republicans with the pre-existing condition coverage thing, right? Yep. So it just shows that healthcare is still a difficult issue for Republicans, and the Democrats at least have caught on to that a little bit. In 2016, they were and that's something that conservatives have to be careful of. But in 2016, they were making the argument that like Republicans were going to lose because they didn't hold hearings for Merrick Garland or something. And it was like, no, no, no. This is about pro-gun voters and pro-life voters. And at least some of them have learned that lesson. And it's something that Republicans have to be careful of and be aware of, because now they're talking about Amy Coney Barrett, not in the context of, some of them are still talking process. And some of them are dumb enough to think that they can motivate more pro-choice voters than we can pro-life and pro-gun voters. But some of them, a lot of them, more of them are talking about the pre-existing condition issue. Mm-hmm. And that's a thing that Republicans have to be very mindful of if they want to motivate more voters over the Supreme Court than the Democrats do.
Well, and they're also running really heavily on character, and which is this is obviously an interesting election, but that's particularly interesting because in the same way that Republicans are banking on people voting for Donald Trump to sort of continue disrupting the establishment, Democrats are banking that there are a lot of voters who are anxious about some of the norms that President Trump has challenged, or that the media maybe says that he's challenged. And so I think both sides, their top line message, if they could say that they were for one thing, Joe Biden would say the soul of the country and the norms, and Donald Trump would say disrupting the Washington norms. I think that's such an important thing to understand about, the difference in how people actually vote and why people actually gravitate towards candidates. I want to run actually one more thing by you on this topic, which is in 2018, I covered Josh Hawley's race in Missouri, and Hawley, from his announcement speech to his acceptance speech, was talking about this trifecta. He would always call out Hollywood, Washington, and Wall Street. And I thought that was really smart. And again, like, it's always important to emphasize, not only do I think that's politically smart, I think he has moral reasons for targeting those three industries. I'm a culture editor, so I'm always curious about Hollywood, but I think Hollywood post Weinstein is becoming more and more of a target, a political target. And in the Trump era, we also have all these states who give Hollywood tax breaks, and we have all of this involvement from Hollywood in politics, almost always to benefit the left. And that's an overdrive in the Trump era. Do you think there's room for the Republican Party to become the anti-Hollywood party? Do you think maybe that worked in Hawley's race in the context of 2018 in Missouri, or do you think that's something that could be more useful on a broader level?
Yeah, I think it is valuable. And I think the reason is that the same elitism that people feel in the capital city of Madison, Wisconsin, and in Washington, D.C., and they feel about the coast more generally, they feel in a very specific and heated way about Hollywood as well. I mean, I remember in 2016, Russ Feingold was getting, piles of money from celebrities left and right, and the stars of West Wing and all of this kind of stuff. And we would actually, on the Ron Johnson campaign, see that information and want it out there in the public, because we understood that was another form of elitism. It was a form of cultural elitism. And the Democrats still just don't quite understand that. Here in Wisconsin, it's been actually pretty interesting. So around the DNC and the RNC, the Democrat Party of Wisconsin, and their chairman, who's a very vocal guy who loves to be in the media, he wasn't in the media for 3 weeks, and nobody could really figure out what was going on. A lot of it, I think, was probably because the DNC being virtual in Milwaukee was sort of a disappointment, and they wanted to just sort of let the National Democrats message this, and they didn't want to get caught in that buzz saw. But the first thing he popped his head up for was this big fundraiser with the cast of The Princess Bride. And I think there's a certain amount of this that people are sort of oh, wow, that's interesting. And of course, it's going to raise a lot of money. But then they did the cast of Parks and Rec. And then they did, Veep. And it's just over and over. And even with shows and programs that people like and stuff like that, at some point, it's just you've got all these actors coming in. And it just shows that the Democrats still don't get it. So maybe they raised a bunch of money. And maybe Princess Bride is quirky enough. And Ted Cruz likes Princess Bride. That the degree to which even voters even care about any of this nonsense. They don't. But maybe they're just sort of okay, that's kind of quirky. But over time, it just shows the degree to which the Democrats continue to think that people care what Hollywood actors think. And they just don't. I think the last, Hollywood actor who anybody cared what he thought was Ronald Reagan. Because he completely eschewed that Hollywood establishment and, really eschewed the rest of the establishment in the country with what he ran on as a conservative. And Democrats just don't seem to get that. And they keep on falling into this trap. And I think it's really potent.
I think people care what celebrities think to the extent that like celebrities are able to create norms. So like they're able to normalize all of these like radical cultural leftist ideas because they're tweeting them into the mainstream and they're Instagramming them into the mainstream. It's not as though people are like, oh, interesting, someone from Modern Family just said I should support this. I must do it because I like this person. It's more that they just sort of are able to inject it into the mainstream of our culture. And it's just the fact that you said that, I'm putting two and two together right now, which is that, yes, the Wisconsin Democratic Party has been hosting all these fundraisers with celebrities. And the DNC, who hosted the DNC every single night? It was a freaking actress.
Yeah,
Like they
totally.
really don't understand how that stuff backfires. They really don't get it. Like you'd think the DNC that's supposed to be the DNC that reaches out to some of those rural voters and to, like, why would you put Hollywood actresses as your host every single night?
Yes, 100%. I was shocked every night when I was watching that. We would be like yelling out loud, like another actress. Like it was amazing. And I think it's because you're right. People feel that cultural pressure. So certain ideas get mainstreamed through the entertainment media, and people, some of it they accept, but they also kind of feel that constant pressure, almost like white noise.
Yeah.
And then it springs forth when you have things like Joaquin Phoenix, who's like a brilliant actor and played Johnny Cash and Joker and some like the best movies, even up until his most recent ones here. In my book, some of the best movies. But then he gets on stage and he like yells at the human race for like separating calves from their mothers. And you know what I mean? She's like, is he talking about like being against milking cows? Or like,
Yeah.
like
He's talking about you, Brian.
I know. I was so offended. Like, and then, case in point, I went and asked my parents if they saw that, and they were like, who is Joaquin Phoenix? What is this? What are you talking about? And then I show it to them, and they're like, oh, I saw that on my Facebook. I'm like, that pisses me off, and it should. And they don't understand. And then every once in a while, you do get one of these actors that just shows how extreme that viewpoint is. And it's really not even about what your politics are. I think most Democrats would be like, yeah, that was a little freaky. But that moment represents a lot of that cultural elitism that people feel in a more vague way all the time.
Well, speaking of farmers, before again, I'm really holding people in suspense about the suburbs.
We're going to talk suburbs at some point.
Yeah, it's going to be like how Jimmy Kimmel always said Matt Damon was going to be on the show, and Matt Damon was never on the show. Suburbs coming right up.
Yes.
But since you have a background in farming, I'm curious how there's a lot of chatter early in the Trump presidency about how he was losing farmers and his trade policies were impacting farmers. This is a two-part question. One, since this has totally left the media conversation, nobody's talking about Trump's trade policies and farmers anymore post-COVID. How are those policies impacting the farming community? And two, how are they impacting the farming community's support or lack of support for Donald Trump?
The reality is that the USMCA is still being implemented, but both the Republicans and the Democrats recognize the value that it was going to play in rural areas, as evidenced by Nancy Pelosi allowing there to be a vote. She didn't do that so that Donald Trump would have a talking point. She did that because people like Ron Kind in the western part of Wisconsin needed it. Although actually she probably did it more for people in some other districts and things like that. But the reality is that that is policy that can change things, and the Democrats recognize it too. The thing that was amazing about this, and that speaks to the impact on rural Wisconsin and dairy country and flyover country in general, is that you would have all of these writers coming into Wisconsin, and they would treat like rural voters like zoo animals. They would be like, here is the rural voter in its natural habitat, where Donald Trump's policies are hammering them every day, and they somehow continue to support him. It was just like really, really bizarre and patronizing. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that farmers, when you talk to people where I'm from, they understood that by taking it to China and by being willing to shake things up, that things were going to get tougher. People had a sense that there was going to be, no gain without a little bit of pain, in the sense that you have to be willing to walk away from the negotiating table. You have to be willing to put up with some difficulty in order to change things. And these are people who have understood for 30, 40 years that whether it's China or other bad international actors, someone's screwing them, right? Like the prices in the store are one thing, and then the price they get at market for their milk or their crops, whatever their product is another thing. And there's clearly a bunch of middlemen in between. And Donald Trump grabbed onto one of those middlemen, specifically China, although there are also others, and said, no, this guy's been ripping you off. We're going to punch back. And that's not just like anger and emotion. that's an intellectual understanding of the fact that in order to change these trade deals, you have to be willing to put pressure on the other side. You have to be willing to walk away. And, people kind of just thought it was because farmers were angry and didn't get it. And it's actually like, no, they actually get it in a very big way. And that was hard for a lot of Republicans, right? I mean, a lot of Republicans are free trade people instinctively, and they've needed to see President Trump's trade deals come around the bend where they get, re-inked. And we do have trade deals. We're not just talking about never trading with anybody and having a big wall of China around the U.S. We are talking about trading. We're talking about changing how it's done. So free and fair trade kind of became a thing, whereas before it was sort of like you had to be for free trade or you had to be for, basically the direct opposite alternative. There was no middle way. So I think he's shown that there is a middle way, and I think farmers instinctively understood that. And that's not to say, by the way, that all of them love everything the president does or everything that he says. I mean, I think most Republicans and conservatives have, a couple of tweets that they'd love to have not seen happen, right?
Yeah, a couple.
At minimum.
A couple a day.
Yeah. And I'm sort of teasing the suburban thing here because, I mean, obviously there are a lot of suburban voters who feel that way about the president's style, but even amongst rural voters, everybody thinks that. They're thinking for themselves. And so the reason that they support this is because they see that he's fighting for them and they see how the policy can ultimately have a positive impact for them. It's not just because they've got their pitchforks raised in the air and they can't see clearly.
So how is it panning out for them right now in your view?
Yeah, I think that so the milk price has rebounded here and there. It's still tough. The real challenge and problem is that there has been so much consolidation, which is sort of a thing aside from government. Government doesn't control all of this, contrary to what a lot of people think. And there is still pain and economic hardship in the farm community. But I think that there is a feeling that the USMCA will have a positive impact. I think that's beginning to happen. And I also think that there's a sense that the agriculture industry is going through a reset in general, which is it's been consolidating and heading toward bigger and bigger farming for so long that we got to hope that the pendulum is going to swing back the other way in some form or fashion, and that there are going to be ways for smaller farmers to find niche markets for their products. And so we do ultimately need more trade, and we do ultimately need more markets opened up. We need them opened up in a fair way, and we need to find a way for small farmers to be able to continue to subsist. So that remains a challenge, but it's not a challenge because of President Trump's policies. He didn't start that. And in some ways, things like the USMCA, I think, are creating an opportunity for there to be some more certainty.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. I will transition into the suburbs finally. So now this is an important issue because the suburbs of Milwaukee are a case study that you can apply pretty much in all of these swing states: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and I mean they're like suburbs anywhere else, except for that they are hardcore Republican strongholds. It's the WOW counties is what they're referred to in Wisconsin, and they're always this like island of red and a sea of blue. They're hardcore. Brian, what's going on in the suburbs right now? Are Republicans worried about what's happening in the WOW counties? And if so, why? What might either keep voters home or drive them to Biden?
Yeah, there is a shift going on. Again, like most political trends, it predates any one particular political figure. So this has been going on longer than President Trump. Although President Trump coming in and driving up the support in the rural areas, there are places where there's going to be trade-offs, and some of the trade-offs are in the suburbs. And so there is a change going on. It's very interesting. We've gone in a couple of elections, we've gone from a period where the WOW counties in the southeast Wisconsin Republican areas were like total 100% Republican stronghold, and the rural areas were super swing, to where that's beginning to change. Now, it is a misnomer to say that the WOW counties are now swinging for Democrats. They're still strong Republican areas, and that is something that is specific and different about these southeast Wisconsin suburbs. They do have a stronger track record of Republicans and conservatives. They do have more conservative voters. They are places where Republicans still win.
They're not going to go blue.
Right. It's not this mass exodus that the national media is describing, but the areas are changing. And so what we are seeing is that there are some closer battles in southeast Wisconsin for some assembly seats than there would have been in other years. And those campaigns are fighting very hard and working very hard on the ground to try to change that. And there's a couple things going on. So on the one hand, in southeast Wisconsin, the president has really consolidated the Republican vote. So he now has like post 9/11 George W. Bush numbers amongst Republicans. And in 2016, there were some Republicans who were still a little unsure because he was so unconventional. And so they might have came out and voted because of the Supreme Court or because of Ron Johnson's race, and they may have voted for the president or not, but there was a certain amount of uncertainty. He has since enacted historic tax cuts, unleashed the economy, rebuilt the military, all of these things that they see, okay, he governs in a way that actually is in line with our values, Supreme Court judges, all that. And so he has consolidated a lot of the Republican vote that was maybe unsure of him last go around. So that is a wind blowing in the Republicans' direction. The winds blowing against the Republicans are the in-migration of more liberal voters from Milwaukee, and there's demographic shifts going on, and so there are people who lived in downtown Milwaukee condos who are sort of like center left to liberal. They probably care more about social issues than they do about economic issues, stuff like that, and then they move out to Tosa. And then after they've had their first starter home, they move out to a bigger house out in Brookfield. And whereas once it was like total Republican stronghold only, it now has a lot of these younger, more liberal families and voters moving into these areas. And so there's demographic shifts that are going on, and people want to pin it on one politician, appealing to rural voters and being repellent to suburban voters. That's not totally true. There's demographic shifts going on as well.
But is it true? So is it true that Trump, that some certain aspects of Donald Trump's character are repelling suburban women who would be encouraged to vote, who would always vote Republican, reliable Republican voters who might vote for Biden this time around because they are so sort of disgusted with the antics of Trumpism?
There are voters there who agree with his policies and not his style. And there's no question that there are suburban women and college-educated women and all these other demographics that you hear about who do not like everything that they see and are therefore more open to voting for Democrats. That the number of Republicans who are turning away, I think a lot of people feel like the number of Republicans who are turning away is much smaller than the number of liberal and Democratic voters who are moving into these suburbs. The suburbs themselves are changing, but there is some of that going on. The flip side, though, is that a lot of these suburbs, in addition to having a lot of traditional conservative Republicans who are still going to vote for President Trump because of his policies, in addition to that, there are also an opportunity to win college-educated male voters who may not vote the same way as the college-educated suburban women who are turning toward the Democrats. There's also an opportunity to win over not only blue-collar men in some of these neighborhoods, because some of these suburbs are sort of more exurban, like kind of working-class neighborhoods, but also to win over working-class women. So there's a lot more types of voters in these areas than I think the national media necessarily always zooms in on. So there's a lot of countervailing winds blowing in a lot of different directions at this point. And it is true that the suburbs have become more of a battleground and become more fertile ground for Democrats than they used to be. But in Wisconsin, these southeast Wisconsin suburbs are still stronger Republican than other places in the country. And there's still an opportunity for Republicans to win here in ways that there necessarily aren't in other states. And that's part of the reason that you saw, when Democrats in Michigan and Pennsylvania, their Republican nominees lost the governorship by large margins and they lost, a bunch of seats in the legislature. You saw in the Scott Walker-Tony Evers race, it got decided by 1 point, and you saw Republicans hold on to their legislative seats and basically maintain their entire majorities. Part of the reason for that is because Southeast Wisconsin suburbs do still see more in common with themselves with Republicans than maybe some other parts of the country. So it's definitely a challenge, but in Wisconsin, there's an opportunity to win here in a way that there may not be in other places, unless, there are unexpected things that happen, which can always occur.
Does Amy Coney Barrett impact that calculus for some voters at all, or is this kind of like it's just sort of floating separately from what is driving people to vote or not to vote?
Yeah, good question. I think it does, and the question is, are Republicans able to do what they have been able to do in the past, which is mobilize pro-gun and pro-life voters and other kind of single issue or maybe just focus on a couple small set of issue voters who really care passionately about those issues? Is it used as an effective mobilization tool? A lot of average voters aren't like walking around saying, "Did you hear what Amy Coney Barrett said the other day?" Like they're not paying that level of attention to it. But they do know that a Republican nominee for the Supreme Court is important to their Second Amendment rights or is important to the pro-life movement or whatever. And so they're mobilized by groups and organizations that are out there knocking on their door, making sure they've got the wit, making sure they understand. So as long as Republicans can utilize it as a mobilization tool like they did in 2016 and like they have traditionally, we've seen that Republicans can outperform Democrats in that game. The big wild card on Amy Coney Barrett is the degree to which the Democrats are focusing on pre-existing conditions and saying that the Republicans want to wipe that out. They don't want your pre-existing conditions to be covered. And by the way, they want a court that's going to just gut healthcare laws and cement it and make it the law of the land. Right. And so the question is, can Democrats out-message that in a way that kind of overcomes the traditional Republican and conservative ground game around guns and life and other issues like that?
If you had to, you may reject the premise of this question or maybe just the question itself, but if you had to guess, as we're sitting here in early-ish October, who will win Wisconsin, Trump or Biden? Would you be able to say, do you think it's clearly trending in one direction or the other, or do you think it's a toss-up?
Yeah, fair question. I'll challenge an aspect, just to say whether it was today or a year ago, there's a certain element of my answer that always has to be, it will be too close to tell in Wisconsin. The polls are a little bit tougher right now on a national level in terms of what people see in Wisconsin than is actually the reality on the ground. So I'll get into that in a second. But at the end of the day, I really think that anybody trying to predict Wisconsin is probably taking something for granted. And so I think that ultimately Wisconsin bounces on a knife's edge. I actually touch on this in the National Review piece. This is true. From 2012 to 2018, Wisconsin was the most evenly balanced state mathematically in the country. So it was like 0.05%, I think, balanced toward Republicans. That's the narrowest margin. That's the closest to zero that you can possibly get when comparing to all the other 49 states in this great nation. And so Wisconsin truly structurally balances on a knife's edge in a place that most places don't. So it's dangerous to make a prediction. What I would say is that I think, the national polling average for Wisconsin, in terms of polls that we're looking at here at the Badger State, had it like Biden +7. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that because Wisconsin is so structurally balanced, and because, frankly, the Republicans have a stronger ground game set up and a field program because the Democrats really haven't been doing doors and that in-person contact, and because there are some indicators in the in-state polls, which are, if there's a good, credible in-state poll, it usually is more credible than the national polls. Those polls, those in-state polls, the Marquettes of the world, the University of Wisconsin-Madison Elections Center, Research Center polls of the world, they have it at like 4 points, which is within the margin of error. And so I think that Wisconsin has a chance to tighten in a way that other battleground states are not going from that kind of 7-ish, 6-ish point lead for Biden closer to a 3 or 4 point lead. That's already happening on some level. I think there's a likelihood that more of that happens. So there's going to be tightening. Now, a lot of those polls, almost all useful polls, were taken before the president's COVID diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And so we'll have to see how that affects things. So right. There's always caveats, there's always October surprises, but that was the general trend in Wisconsin on the ground that I think is true for a lot of reasons. And we'll see if there's anything that's going to shake that up or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Brian actually just recently debated Charlie Sykes, and it was a Cap Times event. It's available on YouTube. It's a really interesting conversation. Maybe it's more of a conversation than a debate, but people who are familiar with the conservative movement and familiar with Wisconsin politics should know that Wisconsin's conservative talk radio culture is really strong. It still is. Charlie Sykes was a huge part of that. And here he is now debating Brian on the future of the Republican Party of Wisconsin. And, what was so interesting to me about this conversation is that both of you agreed that Trump voters, you kind of tried to ask Charlie what he thinks of those people who vote for Donald Trump because they do think he tells it like it is. And there is something so appealing to them about his anti-establishment message. You asked him what he thinks of those voters. And he said, you know what, I know those voters. And what you disagreed on is Charlie is saying we need thought leaders to take control and tell those voters, that when Donald Trump says something that is perceived as racist or xenophobic, to cut it out. That when Donald Trump breaks some valuable norms, as he does do sometimes, thought leaders are the ones who need to step in and say, cut it out. Doesn't that seem completely backwards and like the opposite of the lesson that we should be taking from the Trump era? Is that what we need is more elite control?
Yeah, it's the opposite of what we should take away from the Trump era. It's also the opposite of what we should be taking away from case studies in states like Wisconsin, and I'm sure there's examples in other states where the reality is that the voters decide things in this country, and the reality is that there is a wisdom to the voters that shouldn't be just sort of discarded. And when there is someone who connects with a large mass of the electorate, a large chunk of this country, specifically when there's a connection with maybe voters who weren't engaged before or who are switching parties and they're being persuaded, there's something going on there other than people just being fooled, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good debate with Charlie. I'm not going to say anything on here that I wouldn't have said to him in the debate, but it was an interesting discussion. But the idea is that people need to be told. And, you know, kind of the counter to that I was talking about, and it's not necessarily an argument in favor or against of any one political candidate. It's just sort of a statement of political gravity, which is that parties are built by people. And if people are electing and gravitating towards someone, there's something going on there, and you've got to understand it, and you've got to be able to tap into it, and you've got to be able to steer it as opposed to just eschewing it. You know, and that's part of the reason, that's part of what happened in Wisconsin, not only in 2010, but in 2016 and in years leading up to those elections, where Wisconsin Republicans were like, we have an opportunity to connect with some voters here. Let's do this. We should run toward the political energy, not away from it.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that you're right about that observation. And the other thing about it is there's a desire to force Republicans to constantly be deciding whether they want to support or condemn whatever it is that the president is doing. And it's always like there's one or the other, right? It's like, depending on the story, most of the time, like 60 or 70% of the time, the story is Republicans walked in lockstep again with President Trump. And then the other 30, 40% of it is just like two Republicans disagree with President Trump and their party is cratering and going the way of the Whigs, you know? And like those are the two narratives. It's usually the one, but sometimes it's the other. And the reality is that what you have is Republicans who agree with a lot of the president's policies. They like the way he shakes things up. They like the way he takes on convention. And sometimes he says things that they don't like and that they disagree with, and they speak up in those instances. And so it's true that the party is very much President Trump's party right now. That's true of every president who's been elected by a party. I mean, they're the leader of that party. It's the person that the voters selected. But there's a little bit of a desire to sort of force everybody to say, oh, all these voters have been fooled, and all of these other Republicans are just sort of mindlessly following. And the truth is always more complex than that.
I picked your brain on sort of all your areas of expertise, but one that we haven't talked enough about is the fact that you were a local journalist. And I want to close by asking you, as somebody who's worked in that capacity, how important the death of local journalism is to the situation that we find ourselves in right now. Maybe to populism, maybe to what we see with rural voters. I mean, how much of an impact has the death of local journalism had on our politics?
It's been huge. And I think that, you know, look, we can all make critiques of the media and the ways that we think that they don't cover things within proportion and stuff like that. And we could go on and on about that. And I agree with a lot of those critiques. I also know that, you know, local journalism is one of the most valuable forms. And the reality is that there are too many communities in Wisconsin who no longer have a truly local paper anymore. And what happens is, I always used to compare to this. So I came up through some of the smallest weekly newspapers in Wisconsin. Then I worked for one of the smallest dailies, and then I started working for some medium-sized dailies. And then I left the state and got swept up into this ugly place called Washington, D.C. And but for a while, I was in that local media landscape. And the difference is, if you're in Spring Green, Wisconsin, where one of the closest towns to the farm where I grew up, and you read the home news, you pick up the home news, it's got a picture of your kid and their sports team. Right. It's got a kind of factual recitation of what happened at the school board, and it's got like a picture of that like big gaping hole where all the stuff is disappearing into in the middle of the street for some weird reason. And you know all that's true, right? Like, you know that's true. And then you compare that to newspapers that cover bigger communities or that cover the national scene. You don't have a way of knowing whether that's true. And so a lot of the I talked about some of the traps that the media falls into. I said that, you know, I do think there are good people trying to do a difficult job in journalism, but they also fall into a lot of traps. And there are bad actors, of course. There are people who are biased.
Oh, yeah.
and utilize the platform for that, right? But there's also a lot of traps that the media falls into that create bias. And when you don't have that local newspaper, people lose faith in media that's further away from them. And media that's further away from them does kind of tend to treat them like zoo animals anyway. And so it's a real problem. I mean, there are all these news deserts all across states like Wisconsin and others where you don't have that local paper to pick up to sort of like have to ground you alongside of the whatever big state paper you have, and whether you happen to read any national media, and then what you're seeing on your social media, and people are lacking a lot of that foundational information. There are some communities that still have great local papers, and those communities are much better off.
It also destroys the pipeline where you have people like I've never covered local politics, and here I am covering national politics, and you have fewer and fewer national journalists who have any experience covering politics on a local level, which means they don't have a lot of contact with voters and with people in their communities. And so you do have a really interesting perspective, having grown up on a dairy farm, worked as a journalist, and then turned into a Republican operative.
Well, all that stuff was dumb luck. So if it keeps me grounded, I'm lucky to have stumbled through that stuff, because the reality is that, a lot of people who work in politics and a lot of people who work in media don't have the opportunity to do that. So I'm thankful for it. But hopefully there's a way forward here. That was one of the things with the conversation with Charlie, is the irony is I felt like maybe I was articulating a little bit more optimism about the direction of the Republican Party and conservatives, and therefore, frankly, optimism about the voters and this whole ecosystem. So I hope that not all of the things that the Democrats and the never-Trumpers and the media say about Republicans right now are true, because if they were, it would truly be a dark picture, like way darker than the liberals ever thought Dick Cheney thought about the world, right? Like very, just so dark. And it's just like, it can't be that dark.
The other thing I like about that point is it acknowledges this is still a question in progress, right? Like, we don't have the answer to all of these questions about the Trump era and like the Never Trump movement, and the media wants to have really black and white answers to all of these questions, and honestly, we don't. But Brian, this has been a fantastic conversation. Where can people follow you on Twitter?
They can follow me at Brian J. Reisinger, and I'll try to post stuff that I'm writing and other things going on in Wisconsin politics, and try to keep it interesting along the way. So thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, thank you, Brian. We will be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.